Let's continue talking about animation, and what I'd like to do right now is explore another facet of animation. In the last video, I talked about doing a transition, and the transitions they're kind of simpler, so they do kind of one thing, like you change a value and then the computer animates over time to the new value. Okay, so here I'm changing the rotation and the scale and the position of this thing. And I've got two extremes, right? And the computer animates between those, right? But what if you wanted to have an animation that was a little more complicated? So CSS gives us two tools for animation. They give us transition and all of the little sub pieces that come with it, like, timing function and some of the others, right? And then they also give us this other property here called animation. Okay, and let me uncomment this, and then we'll go over what's going on there in a moment. Let me get rid of this other one, right? Let me get rid of that, and then I'll hide this thing, right? So here I have a box that's spinning, and to spin the box, what I'm doing is I'm using animation and a keyframe. Okay, so here I have a box, and I've defined it with a background color, width and height and some other features. And then I gave it an animation name. I called it spin, and an animation duration, and I set it to 4,000 milliseconds, and an animation iteration count. So the iteration count is like how many times it will play the animation. The name right here refers to this block down here that says @keyframes. So @keyframes is a special block that contains a keyframe animation, and I'm taking this animation and applying it to this element, right? And you could apply the spin animation to any element, and each element could have its own way of applying the spin. So you could set the duration differently for each time you apply this. You could set the iteration count differently for each application also, right? So let's go over this and rebuild this really quick and talk about how and why it works. So I'm going to just delete all that and start over again, right? So I have a div here called box, right? So it's just an empty div, and what we want to do is we want to make it visible, because right now it doesn't have any height, right? So we can't see it. Doesn't have a background color either, right? So let's give it a class. And I'll set the width to 100 pixels and the height to 100 pixels. And then I'll give it a background color. And I'm going to set the background color to tomato, because tomato is a lot better than red. Okay, it's a nice shade of red. So now I've got that. And then what I want to do is I'm going to define some keyframes. So the keyframes start with this @keyframe block, okay? And what you do is you give your keyframes an identifier, and I'll call my identifier spin, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to define where along the length of the animation that these keyframe values apply to. And there's a couple ways to apply this. I'm going to do it with this %. So I start with 0%, so that would be the beginning of my animation. You can think about this % as a % of the duration. So when we set the duration up here, this will be 0% of that duration, right? Okay, and then I'm going to use transform rotate, and I'll start at 0. So this keyframe at 0%, at the beginning of the animation, the rotation value will be 0. And then what I'll do is I'll set another time block or property block, I don't know what to call this, right? And I'll set this to 100%. So if the duration was 5 seconds, then this would be at 0 seconds, and this keyframe here would apply at 5 seconds. And what will happen is the computer will animate from this keyframe to the next one over the course of the 5 seconds. Okay, so let's set this to transform, rotate, and I'll set the rotation to 360 degrees. Okay, and I'll test my animation, and nothing's happening now. So what I want to do is I want to apply the spin animation to the box. So, and there's a couple ways to do this. You can just type animation, and this is kind of like the overall property. And in here you could set the duration, the name, the iteration count, and all the other properties. But I'm going to spell them out with each individual property name. So I'll set animation name to spin. So this is going to refer to the keyframes that we set here with the same name. Okay? There we go. And then I'm going to set the animation duration. So this is how long the animation takes. So we used 5,000 in the earlier example. Let's use 5,000 here. So we'll say 5,000 milliseconds. So that should be 5 seconds, right? And if I ran the animation now, you'll see it spins and then it stops 5 seconds later, but it doesn't keep spinning, right? And that's because we haven't set the iteration count. So sometimes you want an animation that plays once, and then you can leave this out. I'm going to go to animation iteration count, and there's a couple built-in choices. You can choose unset, initial, inherit. Infinite means forever. Okay? If you want, you can put a number here, so you could say 5, and so it'll do this animation 5 times, right? So 25 seconds later, it would stop, okay? But I'm going to do infinite here, and then that'll make the animation run forever. So we'll run that, and that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll put a little bit of margin on this to push it away from the edge, right? How about 2 rem? There we go, right? So you'll notice that the animation is kind of speeding up and slowing down. Like it spins all the way around and then it slows to a stop. And then if I watch this corner go around, when it comes all the way back to the top again, it slows down to a stop. And that's because the default animation timing function is an easing function. So what I'm going to choose is I'm going to change the animation timing function to linear. So if I have an animation that plays forever and I want it to run smoothly, I'll pick linear here like this, right? And then I'll run, and now we have a constant spin, right? So that's pretty interesting, and there's a lot of applications here. And you can animate a whole bunch of properties. You can animate one property. You can put as many as you want in here. You can also have as many stops along the way. So if you had something that you wanted to happen in the middle here, like you wanted it to spin and then scale in the middle and then scale back down, you could do that here too, right? So anyway, that'll get you started with animation. So what do you need to do? You need to define some keyframes, give them a name, and then apply the name of that animation to your element. And along with the name, include the duration, the iteration count, and maybe the timing function if you need it. Okay, so anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll continue this and do some more complex animations in the next video.